So Adam Silver, after securing $76 billion with multiple partners on a new TV deal, Amazon, NBC, ESPN, him and the NBA seem to have won the current day battle, but they have not quite yet won the war. Because right now the media landscape is changing so fast. It's harder to get younger viewers' attention because they have a plethora of options that the younger NBA fan bases of before never had. So the league right now is still struggling to kind of grasp that generation's attention span. Meanwhile, entering into streaming, it's appealing to make the game more global. And in order for the NBA to do so, they have to make the game a bit easier for international stars to come in and actually cook. So the dynamic of the game has changed. The three-point shooting, the spacing. The NBA game itself today definitely is showing more skill than athleticism. But then again, it's not translating on television. So in this segment right here, we're going to break this down layer by layer as Adam Silver is going on a press run to kind of tamper down the noise of just the game being too repetitive, all the three-point shooting, also the ratings being down. And right now we have to understand there's a lot of independent media outside of the typical ones that the NBA is used to controlling, like ESPN. And a perfect example I can give of this exact scenario is when the NBA went down to Mexico City and the media in Mexico was asking Silver, when is he going to bring a team down here? And just understand, Silver does not like the optics of bringing a team down there and it just being a bunch of white guys being the owner. He's sort of making a pitch to the businessmen down there to bring some sort of infrastructure and some sort of partnership along with the league so they can make sure that transition happens smooth, and the optics are not good. So the importance of the owners of the team being Mexican bred, Mexican born, Mexican natives is important. And also the relationships have to be established, as well as the NBA establishing the relationships with the media so they can somewhat control the narratives. And this is how that ties into this situation. As the media landscape grows bigger and bigger, there's more independent outlets, there's more content creators. The noise around the low ratings is high, and the noise around the game being repetitive is insane. But before we hear from Silver and his multiple press runs, let's take a look at Andrew Sharp from Sharp Tech explain the NBA's conundrum of how they secure such a large deal, but yet it's kind of operating in a gray area. It's almost like they won the current day battle, but there's still a long war to fight.
So I think looking back, the real genius on the NBA's part, or the miracle, I should say, is that they were able to drum up some competition for these bids. And I think that's one of the things that has kept the NFL from being able to extract like trillions of dollars from companies, because the networks that air the NFL love paying for the NFL, but there aren't like people trying to beat down the door to buy NFL rights. It's just sort of the same group of networks, and the NBA managing to convince NBC and then carving out a little package that they were going to sell to some streaming platform or Warner Brothers Discovery, who I guess has HBO Max, to circle back to the merger. That has allowed them to sort of create a bidding war and I think get more money for the rights than makes any sense. But, you know, some of the legacy networks, this is really all they have to try to bilk out cable transmission fees for the next 10 years and then figure out what the future of the business looks like. The future of the business doesn't look particularly promising, but everybody's just trying to buy time at this point. And the NBA knew that they had those networks over a barrel and they were able to capitalize, at least for now. I think it's going to be a much trickier situation when you get 10 years down the road and some of these networks are really going through it. And God only knows what the ratings will look like at that point.
And God only knows if they will have the real access to the data for the ratings. That's really the question that no one has asked yet. What are the stipulations of the TV deal? We hear about the money, the billions of dollars, but we all know it's really about the terms. Netflix and other streamers, they tend to like to hide their numbers on what they're really doing. but will the league have access to it? Especially Amazon. Will they have access to those numbers? Because we all know Amazon, they have an ability to sell products directly to the people that are watching. So is there a way for the NBA to actually gain that data and utilize it for themselves? They can actually learn what their audience likes to watch. Maybe an audience in a state like Pennsylvania, maybe they like to eat Doritos versus an audience in Arizona, they like to eat Pop-Tarts. It's just an example. But they can get this type of detailed data from their new streaming partners. And Adam Silver making his press run seem real defensive. It's almost like he's defending the perception of the NBA. As he sat down with Colin Cowherd, we're going to start off here. And Silver is almost beat down to submission, actually admitting that sometimes the game does somewhat get too repetitive. You guys check it out, and every once in a while, I'll check in.
I'm going to throw this at you. I said this the other day about the aesthetic of the NBA. It's a bit homogenous, a little cookie cutter. And I said, listen, I don't mind three-pointers, but if the NFL was just you could run the ball and throw bombs. No layering, no drag routes, no tight end screen. It was just run it or bombs. Optically, it's not as fascinating. And I love the three-pointer. But like, and you know this, you're a pretty progressive thinker, I think. Athletes are better. Wemby can pull up and cross you over on a dribble and shoot. They couldn't do that 10 years ago. And the truth is, because your players are so gifted and it's such a global pool, the three-pointer is too easy. And I have simply said, I would put the three-pointer, I would have it go into the bench about 6 feet up, eliminate the corner. I'd bring back the hand check. I do like physicality. Your athletes are so great, it's become too easy to hit it. And the optics on it are repetitive. I think there's numbers, ratings that prove people are, they like layers and power forwards and physicality and not just dunks and threes. What do you do to solve that? Because I think you've engaged with people and acknowledged it can be a bit repetitive. It is a bit of an issue. What do we do to change it?
The hardest question is the last one you asked. What do we do to change it? I agree to the extent that you start to see very similar offenses around the league. You know, teams have brands, teams have identity. You know, Joe Dumars is a colleague now at the league office, the Bad Boys, et cetera. You know, I think, you know, the Showtime Lakers. So I recognize that to the extent that offenses start to look very similar, we lose that. At the same time, the league is going through a transformation. Just as you said, players like Victor Wembanyama, players like, you know, Jokic are doing things big men never did historically. I mean, It wasn't that long ago, Colin. You'll remember that conversations you had with David Stern, we would bemoan the lack of skill among some players, that, you know, there was a sense there was too much physicality around the game.
Yes.
That the play under the basket, you know, that you would have, you know, the Hack-a-Shack era. You know, there were big men that just couldn't shoot free throws. There are no big men anymore who can't shoot. Free throws, just as one comparable from generation to generation, have never been higher. So I think we just got to be careful. Like, the one thing I want to do is, I don't want to sort of knee-jerk move the three-point line. We're sort of going through a process now, seeing how these players are adapting to the new rules and figuring out if whatever changes we should make. I mean, to be honest, I wish it were as simple as just moving the three-point line back, because then we would just do it. I mean, part of the concern from the basketball folks is that if you move the three-point line back, you'll end up sort of just clogging up, you know, the sort of the area under the basket. And that's not such attractive basketball either. I think this is doable. I think by examining the game and sort of seeing where it's going, I mean, it frustrates me a little as well, because it's obviously you're representative of what a fair number of people are saying about the game. And I watch it night in, night out. And we're seeing some of the most incredible athleticism and skill in the history of this league. I mean, again, Victor Wembanyama. But I think you're also saying, too, that if we move the three-point line back, and what we ended up with was Victor Wembanyama standing under the basket the whole time and just waiting to dunk, that wouldn't be interesting either.
Right.
So you know, one, I assure you, we are on it. I think it's a very fixable issue.
It is a fixable issue. But one thing that stands out is the acknowledgement that the analytics, quote unquote, what the data says, Silver used to love to say that. A lot of that analytical bullshit, it does not translate well on television. This is pretty much the acknowledgement of this. And this is nothing new. People have been saying this since the James Harden, Houston Rocket years. Outside of that fan base, nobody liked the way they play basketball. That was not enjoyable to watch at all. It's just a bunch of dribbles through the legs. It's either going to be a layup for a foul or James Harden just shooting a three. That's just not good basketball. But also going back to when Silver always used to say, we're looking at the data. The data says this, the data says that. Here's Silver actually acknowledging that the data was wrong and that all the rest period, the load management, and the science, quote unquote, was wrong about the actual rest time. The more these NBA players rest, the more likely it was for them to get hurt, especially with this new scheduling that they have. A game, then a rest day, game, rest day, game, rest day, for long stretches of periods. It's resulting in teams not having the ability to practice on their day off because they have to travel, they have to watch film, there's not enough time. And players of the past used to have, kind of a grueling schedule, but they would have periods where they have 3 to 4 days off. And that allowed them to build up a calluses to last throughout the season. And also at the same time, actually having a full committed day off where there's no travel, no nothing. Because right now, the way the scheduling is, with a game day off, players' day off is pretty much their travel day, their day to watch film. They don't get a full rest day where they're not, pretty much where they get a day to themselves. And it offers very little time for hard practices in between these games.
All I can say is we've worked with our teams. We're working a lot on the science. I think, incidentally, you don't hear load management so much around the league anymore because I think we've dispelled that notion that it's somehow through some analytics or a computer program that on November 12th, you can make a decision that a player should sit out on December 20th, which is what was going on in the league. And in fact, my understanding, at least of the data that's come in so far, it may even be the case that some of the early season injuries are caused by players not having enough load. Because
Thank you.
Now, right there, look at Colin Cowherd's sentiment. Thank you. It's about time they admit this. Because for the older NBA fans, them seeing players have a crazy workload and barely any injuries happen, it's fairly obvious to them that today's players are having too much rest time. Because why are all these injuries happening when they have plenty of days off? Something is not adding up.
Yeah, again, it's kind of fascinating. Like when I got to the league a little over 30 years ago, a lot of players would take the month of August and literally go fishing.
Yeah.
They would chill out and they would eat a little bit more, gain a little bit of weight. They'd come into training camp, and that's when you got back into shape. And you'd lose those pounds and you'd play your way and train and practice back into game shape. Now, there's hardly a player in the league that isn't working out every single day. Guys even go to the finals. They take a day off, they're back on the floor. But often it's specialized one-on-one training, it's weight room work, whatever it is. It's not 5-on-5 basketball. And a lot of it, in fairness, these players, and that's what frustrates me too, because they don't take a day off. They're some of the hardest working athletes out there. But then they have it in their head that they're more likely to get injured if they're playing 5-on-5 basketball.
They're not. Yeah.
So,
yeah.
Right. So then they come back into training camp, and it's still not necessarily 5-on-5. There's the preseason.
Silver, come on, keep it 100, man. Keep it a buck. The preseason is shortened, and guys are barely practicing that hard like they used to during the preseason. There's barely 2-a-days. The preseason is fairly short. If guys are coming off of injuries, they barely have enough time to ramp up, to get into game shape, to get into game speed, get their bodies used to playing at game speed. They're getting way too much rest time, and by the time they get up to game speed, they're actually in the game, then they get hurt.
Again, minutes are limited. Then boom, the regular season comes, and at least I can't say it's perfect. I know it's causation yet, but there's certainly correlation early in the season that you see those guys. And it's interesting. It used to be we would hear from teams that you're going to injure our players if they play for, USA basketball, the U.S. national team, the Olympic team,
right,
or the national teams, from the countries they're from. In fact, it's the opposite. We have fewer injuries, and maybe not surprisingly, from the guys who participate in competition over the summer, because the load is maintained. They're not overdoing it. But they come back, and there's that the consistency of the load, throughout the off season. So I think this is an area too where better data, AI is changing everything.
Yeah.
Where we're going to be in a position, I think, where we can convince the teams and convince the players that actually playing is in their interest. But unfortunately, we're never going to be able to completely solve that issue for that family that comes to that game and is disappointed.
Now, Silver, that's going to be a hell of a feat, because the younger generation of players, they come into the league expecting a load management day. Many vets like Damian Lillard spoke on this. Young guys are coming in expecting a day off after a certain amount of time. So this will be a cultural shift internally that the NBA will have to go through. And most importantly, we have to admit, it's about the money also. The streaming services paid all that money for the games. They do not want star players to be out, because entering streaming, these games are going to be a lot harder to find. And imagine if the narrative gets out there that star players are taking games off. People are not even going to check for these games. I mean, just think about it. When you log into your Amazon, your Peacock app, or even the brand new ESPN streaming app, they're going to have a bunch of icons on the menus showing different shows, movies, documentaries, clips. You have a lot to choose from. So in order to click on the game, you have to bypass all that. And the NBA product is going to have to be on point to maintain that attention span, because streaming is a different interaction with the audience from television. Long gone are the days of people flickering through a television channel, or even a television channel having the power to just show one programming for that hour block. Yeah, these brand new interactions are going to have to be taken into consideration. But continuing on his press run, Adam Silver has sat down with Shaquille O'Neal, someone that is part of that TNT show Inside the NBA, where they normally criticize the league. They don't show no hesitation on that. But Shaq had a few lines of questionings for Silver. You guys check it out, and every once in a while, I'll check in.
You mentioned early rules changes, and I've always wanted to ask you this personally. How does that process work? Do you say, I want this done, or do people come to you, they complain, you have to go through a process? Does it take months, does it take days, or does it all come and stand with you?
Well, it actually, ultimately, rule changes require a vote of the board of governors, of the people who own the teams. But there's a process through our competition committee. The competition committee includes owners, league officials, I'm on it, players, union representatives, referees. So it's a big group that all comes together, with players to discuss these issues. The one thing I would say, it could go faster in certain instances, but I also am cognizant that we shouldn't overreact. I mean, a good example is the discussion around the three-point shooting right now, and I've heard, your commentary and others on it, and it's something we're looking at closely. But I think it is important that it's a deliberate process, that it run through committees, that there's a general managers committee, that everybody have an opportunity to be heard on it, and we're not sort of herky-jerky moving the line forward, back, et cetera. We made that mistake actually many years ago. People may recall we moved the line in, and I think it was only 2 or 3 years later we moved it back out again. And so again, there's a process. I'm certainly not against making changes. We made one change, Shaq, in response to the whole Hack-a-Shaq issue, as you'll remember. That was an area where we looked at it for several years before we made that change. And there's situations probably where we've waited too long. I think last year, I should say that clarification, in addition to rule changes, there's also what we'll call euphemistically calibrations at the league office. I think like last year there was an adjustment, there was a sense, and part of it was a response to the basketball community that they felt that we were allowing players to hunt for fouls, particularly like in certain offensive plays, or call it, we're not traditional basketball plays. And
jumping into the defender.
specifically done looking for fouls. And I think we made an adjustment because, and that's an area where talk about people involved. You know, Mike Krzyzewski, Coach K, he's become an advisor post-Duke to the competition committee. And I remember him saying at one of the meetings, fans like defense too. You know, and there was a perception out there, I don't think it was accurate, that the league was focused on getting scores higher. That wasn't necessarily the case. I think there was a period where, you know, Shaq will remember, probably, you know, in the early 2000s, I don't know, where there was a sense the game had become too physical. And we weren't allowing players to show off their incredible skills.
And that is fact. The game was way too physical. This is after Michael Jordan had retired. The game was way too physical. You had a bunch of guys trying to imitate Michael Jordan, but they were not as efficient. Michael Jordan, for most of his career, has been above 50%. These guys were shooting 40%, just a bunch of volume shooting, and games would be like 70 to 69, the final score. So it's not appealing at all. Plus, the NBA already had a drop in viewers because of Michael Jordan's retirement.
And so scores naturally then started to creep up. And I think then there was a perception out there that the league felt that scoring high scores in their own right were something that fans wanted. And that wasn't necessarily the case. We wanted more competitive games. We wanted players to be able to demonstrate their skills on the floor. But I think Coach K made a really valuable point that fans also like to see physical defense. They don't want to see guys get hurt out there. They don't want to see, also just like with offense, they don't want to see unnatural basketball plays. But they want guys to be able to be physical.
AKA Houston Rockets, James Harden's Houston Rockets. That's really what it is. And it was birthing a lot of babies underneath that, AKA Trae Young. He was on that same bullshit. It makes for nasty television. Outside of those initial fan bases, of course, the Rockets fan base don't mind, as well as the Atlanta Hawks. But outside of that, for most, it's unwatchable.
I'm not so concerned about the comparisons of, you know, Shaq to Bill Russell necessarily, that to the extent that it becomes a different game, that there's three-point shooting in one era, there's not in another. I think we have to remain contemporary. At the same time, I think we have to be true to the game of basketball. I mean, I think there are certain things, you know, that you hear 4-point shots, things like that, which strike me as gimmicky, you know, honestly. That
Facts. Only the analytical crowd mentions that 4-point shot. It's just for them to continue some more analytics and hopefully land one of these front office jobs. That's really what it's all about at the end of the day for some of these guys, but that's way too gimmicky. And it also destroys the history books at the same time.
Agreed. But on the other hand, I think potentially moving a three-point line, I mean, if you go back, you know, I think it was Red Auerbach thought, you know, it was the end of basketball and the three-point shot was added. And it took several, you know, years, if not, you know, well longer than a decade before teams really started, you know, changing the game in a way to take advantage of the efficiency through three-point shooting. Now, again, maybe it's gone too far. It's something we have to look at, like cutting off the corners on the three-point line. I think you need to have a healthy debate. I think when we're in the room, I think there's a lot of respect there. You know, all those different constituencies there. I think it's important that they all be heard from. But I think there's no problem. I don't have a problem with people being passionate about their positions. I mean, one of the things we try to do coming from the league office is to present the data. I mean, usually those meetings begin on say, all right, exactly what percentage of shots are coming from the paint? What's three-point? What's mid-range? I mean, and speaking of the data, I think one thing that's lost in this discussion is I think a lot of people have this sense that sort of, Shaq, where you know, you won your championships, where you made your living in the paint, that somehow there's a decrease in the number of shots coming from under the basket. That's not the case at all. I mean, what you've seen happen over the last 20 years is certainly it's a highly inefficient shot if you're in 2-point zone right near the 3-point line. So that, like, I think most coaches are saying to their players, go 2 feet back, do whatever you have to do.
Not necessarily the case today. If the floor is so spread out, so the 2-point shot more than likely is an easier shot if you have the right big. That right there is something that has to be more nuancedly discussed in today's NBA. With the floor so spread out, some of these 2-point shots, you see guys like Jalen Brunson utilize this. Same thing for Nikola Jokic, same thing for even Kevin Durant. A lot of teams being so overly focused on threes are allowing the mid-range assassins, or just the guys who could finish near the cup, just around the paint, around the elbows. Those guys are killing it right now.
That's an inefficient shot. But then there's sort of the classic mid-range jumper. And yes, a lot of those shots have moved to three-point shots, but you're still seeing the same percentage of shots in the paint. So again, there's still diversity in the league. I think though, and just again, Shaq, some things that you've talked about on air, I completely agree with you to the extent, not just the three-point shooting issue, but there's a certain homogeneity in the game that it looks that teams are copying each other's styles. I think that's less interesting for fans. And Adam, to your point about what's happened in other sports, and they've all had to respond that analytics seem to take over. And the analytics take you in a certain direction. And maybe it's more three-point shooting, for example, but it makes it less interesting for the fans. And I think back in the day, Shaq, when I think of, the style that you guys played in Orlando and then in LA, or then, think of the Pistons and what their style was versus the Bulls, et cetera. I think there's a lot to be said to that, to teams having identities. And so.
Facts. That's something that's missing from the league today. Teams having different identities, fans tuning in to see how are these two different styles going to clash against each other. Silver needs to find a way to bring that back. I don't know if he needs to allow more hand checking, a little bit more defensive advantages, but they need to find a nice formula to bring that back. Maybe it just takes a new generation of players to come in one draft. Maybe you just have a draft full of guys that are just bigs, that are physical, or you just have a draft of guys that are 6'8 plus, that are defensive minded.
Those are all things that the competition committee is looking at. It's one of the reasons why it's basketball people, but you also have league representatives like myself, owners in the room, to talk about the impact on engagement of our fans. So it's not just a pure basketball discussion. It's also one about what do fans really want to see. So it's all of that has to be in the mix.
Commissioner, there's a lot of talk about viewership, whether it's up or down. I'd like to hear your point of view of that. And you think we'll ever get consistently the same views like we got on Christmas Day?
Well, first of all, we're about even with last year right now in terms of our ratings. We were down initially in the season. We were up against the World Series. Obviously, there was a national election going on, which was driving a lot of viewership towards politics.
Adam giving a little word salad right there, because the World Series is every single year in October and November. So that right there is already a bad excuse. The election makes a lot of sense, especially with the polarizing Trump.
But now, after we had a huge Christmas Day, as I said, we're up on ESPN and ABC. We're down a little bit on our other networks, but we're roughly even for the season. And that's roughly even with last season. And last season was our highest regular season viewership in 4 years. So we're doing fine from a viewership standpoint. I mean, I hear the narrative, and I think it's nothing new. You've been around the league for a long time, Shaq. It's a bit of a sport to pick on the league on occasion. I get it. We got to respond to the critics as well. But I think the fact is, part of the reason for the change in the new television deals is that one of the advantages of the NBA is that we have a very young audience, an audience that advertisers like, an audience that influencers like, but they're not watching as much traditional television that they historically did. I mean, it's interesting. You're younger than I am, Shaq. You're still like I'm now in that official older demographic, in that something like 70% of primetime viewership is comprised of people 55 and older. You got a few years to go. Adam's got a longer time to go. But young people, they're watching an enormous amount of screen time, but not traditional television.
Right.
It's social media. Social media, broadly described, videos on social media. By almost any measure, there's never been more engagement in the NBA than there is at this moment. No time in our history. And I'm not just talking about globally. I mean, when you look at it as a global league, absolutely, it's not even close. But even domestically, but people are consuming our games in other forms. It doesn't mean that it isn't part of my job to find ways to get our fans or potential fans to watch more games live.
That right there especially applies for the younger demographics. And Ja Morant played a big part in that. That's why him and these gun incidents is such a big deal. He attracted a lot of that younger demographic, like ages 7, 8, 9, 10. They love Ja Morant. And he has an organic charisma with that age demographic. They're just attracted to what he brings to the game from a viewing perspective on television. He, in a way, took the slot that was slated for Zion Williamson to be doing that. It was very organic because it's not like anyone thought that Ja was going to pop out of the screen more than Zion, especially during that 2019 draft. But instead, all that social media craze and attention and just organic charisma, it sort of went to Ja Morant, unbeknownst to the league.
Part of what I think we can do better is not just tell the larger stories about players and their lives and off the floor and all that, but then the nitty gritty, what YouTube, streaming, all these different channels allow us to do. Your podcast, frankly, allow fans to better understand the game. I mean, just one example, just even Giannis has been making transformative changes to me in his game this season. He's reduced his number of three-point shots against that trend. He's playing more in the paint. He's talking about it. And he's even talking about how he's learning a new aspect of his game. Playing at the elbow, playing under the basket. And when you read a story like that, then when I'm watching Milwaukee play, I'm looking at something else. Like it creates deeper engagement. It's like, all right, so instead of sort of the type of commentary where, that side didn't want it tonight, or, right, that side not playing as hard, it's like really trying to understand, like, what's Doc Rivers doing with that team?
Now, that's the discussion Silver is going to have with ESPN. Why in the hell were they discussing a Laker hire for a team that's really a play-in team during the NBA Finals? That made no sense. You have an NBA Finals with two of the top players for a new generation, Jason Tatum and Luka, and they spent most of the halftime talking about a JJ Redick hire. Makes no sense. The Lakers are not going to have any impact on that championship going forward unless they make drastic changes, and that may even include trading LeBron James, but they're not going to do that. It's too much money being made.
Like, trying to understand, why has Cleveland had the success they've had so far this season? What makes Kenny such a great coach? It's like, what's really happening? And I think that I'll be self-critical here about the job the league is doing. I think we have to do a better job and not just leave it to commentators, critics, fans to tell those great stories about.
100%. Do not leave it to ESPN. They're no longer in that business. That's another change that's happening. They've gone into the personality-based business. They're no longer into storytelling. Even Zach Lowe, that was the best NBA analyst ESPN had, and they just let go of him because they're more into the Stephen A. Smiths, the Shannon Sharps. They're in the personality business now, and they got to hit numbers. And so the slow buildup of storytelling and just the nuances of the game does not fit into their current business day model.
The game itself, why this game is so special, why I began by saying this transformative era in the league. It's like really trying to understand, like, what's Doc Rivers doing with that team? Like, trying to understand, why has Cleveland had the success they've had so far this season? What makes Kenny such a great coach? It's like, what's really happening? And I think that I'll be self-critical here about the job the league is doing. I think we have to do a better job and not just leave it to commentators, critics, fans to tell those great stories about the game itself, why this game is so special, why I began by saying this transformative era in the league, what it is that you should be looking for as a fan, what's going to draw you in to understanding what makes these players so great, why a combination of certain players on the floor is working in a way that another combination of players isn't.
I think a lot of times where the old heads are not on point is because in this thing of ours, we have more great stories than we have bad stories. What I mean by that, when you think about this game, you can go back to the 60s and 70s. You can go Russell, you can go Magic, you can go Larry, Mike, Kobe, myself. And I was taught as a youngster that if people are going to pay to watch you perform, you put on a show. So I think a lot of times when we as old school players and old heads don't see these guys put on the show, and they're making a lot of money, and they're going to make it harder for you, I think, if they're not putting on a show, and we have to pay these prices and these streaming services. So I think we get on them so they know and understand. It's not that we're hating. It's like we want them to know and understand, like, bro, you're making $50 million, you deserve it, but that little kid that wants to see you play, don't be saying you're taking the night off when you're not really hurt. That little kid that wants to see you play, I know the three is open, but don't you think if you can just go baseline and dunk and just throw it down, it would just protect this thing of ours? So, a lot of people may think it's coming from hate, but for me, it's coming from love. I want you to put on a good show to protect this thing of ours. Guys like Charleston only made $2 or $3 million. I was lucky. I came in '92, and like I always tell people, Commissioner, my dream was to make $8 million for 10 years. That was my whole dream.
And Shaq right here kind of reminds me of a good point to bring up in all this. The money's not guaranteed. That's what a lot of the younger players, guys like Anthony Edwards, LaMelo Ball, and just the newer generation don't really understand, because they've entered the league in a sweet spot where the money's just flowing in, and they have to understand they got to grind it out and make sure the game is appealing enough where the money continues to flow in for the next generation. And the way sometimes they kind of just go through the motion, just handle things, just taking games off, bragging about they're not going to dunk anymore. They're not really positioning the league in a way where the future generations are guaranteed to get that $100 million contract. Because entering into streaming, that is the case. These guys are really going to have to prove and show that the numbers reflect the health of the league, and thus they're going to have bigger deals, because there will be a lot lesser players bidding on the NBA going forward. This marriage to streaming signifies a lot of different things. Mainly network television channels are no longer going to be bidding on these NBA games or just having the NBA rights anymore. So the players that have the rights today are more than likely going to be the guys that are going to have the rights for the foreseeable future, unless some brand new technological shift happens.
And then I got lucky, and I don't know what you and Mr. Stern did, but it went boom, it went crazy. And then I got another hit at 100, and I was like, but my whole process was, okay, you're paying me all this money, I got to put on a show. So I just want people to, know and understand that it's not us just hating. It's like, hey, we don't think you put on a show tonight. We think you need to put on a show to protect this thing of ours. Now, when I say this thing of ours, you know exactly what I'm talking about, Commissioner, because you've done a great job of getting these kids a lot of money, and I commend you for that.
And they got to understand, them getting a lot of money and it keeps going up and up and up is not really guaranteed. That is not a guarantee. And I think guys like Anthony Edwards, sometimes LaMelo Ball and others, they do not have this understanding yet.
This generation of players, I think it is important that they hear from those who came before them, the greats of the game, and not just sacrifices they made, but how they approach the game, that there is an entertainment side to this, that ultimately all of us, are here because of the fans. I'm fortunate to be in this position because of the fans, all the current NBA players, and this whole huge ecosystem built around the NBA that, believe it or not, accounts for something like 50,000 jobs when you start including the people who work day of game in the arena and everything else. It all comes down to those 450 players, but them understanding that this is about something bigger than themselves, and that, yes, at the end of the day, it's about the competition and it's about doing all they can to win, but there is an entertainment side to this. And part it's the realization that, and it goes to television ratings. One thing that's different from the old days, there's unlimited options right now. If you want to sit down and look at a screen, you could be playing a video game, you could be looking at YouTube, you can be looking at unlimited numbers of videos on social media. Yeah, and whatever. I think my cable system has 2,000 channels, and then you go to streaming.
Yeah, all that is competition for the NBA, and that's going to be a hell of a feat, especially for the upcoming generations that basically grew up on all these options
and multiple streaming services. So the competition is fierce, and I think, Adam, that goes back to your question about other leagues, or the NFL on holidays that we're on. It's like, I welcome the competition. I mean, we have to get better as well. I mean, and it's one thing, it's what I lose sleep over, that it every day people are making an election to pay their money to go to an NBA game, or literally every moment you're watching an NBA game, you're sitting there with the clicker deciding, is there something better else that's more engaging to watch? And part of the issue sometimes doesn't get enough focus. It's not just the number of people who watch the game, but how long they watch it. A rating is the average minute. So when people who used to watch a 2.5-hour game for on average an hour watch for 50 minutes instead of an hour, that's a significant decline in your rating, even though it's the same number of people who are engaged in your game. Number one, we're listening to what people say. I mean, I don't want people to think for a second that, to the extent that, they're unhappy with, players that are resting or think there's too many three-point shooting. I mean, as you said before, the community is very focused on those issues. But at the same time, I think that the game has never been in a better place. I mean, I'm astounded on a nightly basis by what.
And he's right about that. The game hasn't been in a better place. The amount of talent that's coming in the league is unfucking believable. I mean, you could look at the teams like the Atlanta Hawks, how many guys that they got, especially in a rebuild. That's how a rebuild looks like today. The Orlando Magic, look at all the talent that they got on their team. Even the Cleveland Cavaliers, they got guys, multiple guys coming off the bench impacting the game. And the top end of that is the Oklahoma City Thunder. It's unreal that they have that many players coming off the bench just affecting the game, not only offensively as well as defensively. So there is definitely an influx of talent, but just as Silver has stated earlier, they are looking at the reactions of the fans in real time, especially through NBA Twitter. You kind of get a real-time reaction on what the fans are really engaging with, what they like versus what they don't like. So this is a good thing about social media. It gives the NBA kind of a way of testing the temperature in the room to see if their product actually engages with fans.
What I'm seeing on the floor. And if anything, I get a bit frustrated at times because I feel there's more that the league office should be able to do to translate what I'm watching in a way that people at home are understanding how incredibly entertaining and off the charts athletic and skilled these players are. And so I genuinely believe the best days are ahead of this league. I should mention too, I'm so proud of what's happening in the WNBA right now with women's basketball. Also, been at that for 28 years now at this, supporting women's basketball, and it's really turned a corner in the last couple of years. So I just think this game, I love this game of basketball. And I think to the extent that we can bring joy to more people's lives through this game, get more young boys and girls playing this game, being part of a team, understanding the values of this game that Bill Bradley has written about and others have talked about. I think it just could be so additive to people's lives.
And that WNBA shows you how a generation of players could change the whole perception of the league. Just some of those girls that have been coming in, just present day and the ones that are coming in currently right now, those girls are already coming in with the ability to just market themselves. Like it's unreal what's going on with the WNBA. It's a really good look, and they are in a great place. So the game overall on the men's side and female side, it is pretty healthy. But again, the league is reacting to some of their feedback on social media in real time. And the noise from that feedback is getting louder and louder. As Adam Silver has sat down with Dan Patrick, and he was kind of on the defense so much that he just brought up an idea of them making a slight change towards the timing of the quarters. You guys check it out.
But what bothers you more, the ratings or the coverage of the ratings?
The ratings are fine. I mean, we're roughly even with last season for the regular season, which was the highest ratings for a regular season in 4 years.
I wonder if Silver's going to answer that second part, because some of that coverage of the ratings is not necessarily coming from their television partner, mainly ESPN, but it's coming from a lot of independent media.
I get it, there was a narrative early in the season, we were down a bit. I it's you've been covering the league for a long time. I mean, it seems that there's always a narrative around our sport. Too physical, too much isolation, scoring too low. Super teams, player empowerment. I mean, I could go on and on.
Yeah.
And then the narrative early in the season became the ratings are down because of three-point shooting. I think those are two independent issues. The ratings are now about even with last year. And as I said, if you look more broadly at other measures of engagement, our attendance last season was the highest in the history of the league. I mean, you can't look at social media over too long a spectrum because it didn't exist, but when you add in social media, the game has never been more popular in terms of the engagement. So do I get frustrated around the narrative around ratings? Yeah, especially when, because of the decline in traditional television, the decline in cable homes, everyone's down a bit. So, plus we entered into our new deals for the next decade. So I feel good about that. But I think those narratives become a reality to the extent, especially even when we're doing well, it's still only a relatively small percentage of the population that's watching live games. So there's a lot of people out there who may not be fans of the NBA and become consumed with that story. And again, NBA seems to take a disproportionate amount of that discussion. I think maybe because we're so relevant from a societal standpoint. Our players have been outspoken. There's been a history of activism, in certain cases in this league. For whatever those reasons, I think at the end of the day, my job is to find more people who are inclined to want to watch live sports, to want to watch basketball, and convert them into NBA fans.
Give me this has been discussed.
I mean, one that's only been discussed a little, I wouldn't put it necessarily in the category of being so wild, is potentially 2 free throws for a foul and a three-point shot. I don't necessarily think I would do it in the last 2 minutes of the game.
Now that's interesting that came up because the league actually made it 3 free throws on that shot because of the 1994 NBA Finals between the Knicks and the Rockets. The Knicks got fouled on a 3-point attempt, but at the time the rule book only allowed them to shoot 2 free throws. But had they had the ability to make a third one, it would have changed that whole series. Perhaps they may have even won the championship. So the league actually changed the rules back then, but it seems like they're changing it back to the original way it was. Very strange that they're considering going back.
But I think that's something interesting. Something else that I'm a fan of, and I'm probably in a minority, as we get more involved in global basketball, the NBA is the only league that plays 48 minutes. And I am a fan of 4 10-minute quarters. I'm not sure that many others are. I mean, putting aside what it means for records and things like that, I think that a 2-hour format for a game is more consistent with sort of modern television habits. I don't think people in arenas aren't asking us to shorten the game, but I think as a television program, being 2 hours, that's Olympic basketball is 2 hours. College basketball, of course, is
Yeah, but
is
if
40
you
minutes.
like it, I'd say it has kind of a little bit of a push there.
Yeah, but it's such a dramatic change to the game. I mean, I think something like that would have to be talked more about over time. I mean, incidentally,
But the pitch clock was dramatic, Commissioner.
Yeah, no, I get it, and I'm a fan of what baseball did. I'm a baseball fan, and I think some of those changes have really increased sort of the engagement, the entertainment value of the game, and so I'm paying a lot of attention to that. And in fact, I've used the pitch clock, the sort of the increasing the size of the base, et cetera, in meetings at the NBA to say, if baseball, which is more locked into tradition, and I don't mean that negatively, than any other sport. And part of what baseball provides is the tradition, the legacy, that if they're able to make those changes, certainly we shouldn't be afraid to look at changes as well. So, I also think, though, we have made a series of changes over the years. They haven't been as dramatic in many cases. We've changed the format in the last 2 minutes of the game so we wouldn't have as many stoppages. We have a coach's challenge now. We had the hack-a-shack issue. We changed the rule there. I mean, there's this. We added the cup, which we now have. We have a play-in tournament. I mean, so
Those two things really benefit streaming. That's just extra inventory for streaming, for them to buy those separate packages. Also, who knows? Maybe they can host those events internationally. You never know. That Saudi money, it's eventually going to look enticing.
We've made significant changes.
But it is what it is. It looks like Silver is trying to find a perfect medium without having to take away from the 82 game scheduling. Maybe shorten up the time of the game between quarters. It sounds reasonable. At first, it sounded crazy, but that may be their response to that 82 game scheduling. But then again, 82 games works perfect for streaming, especially, the fact that they're going to need inventory heading into that platform. Who knows? Netflix might be interested the next time around their television deal comes up. So there you have it. Silver weathered the storm pretty well. He has a crazy task ahead of him. He already secured a $76 billion deal. But at the same time, there is a war, a cold war, I should say, that's still raging on. And he's going to have to put out a few of the fires. But he has done a great job getting these guys paid. But he has to make sure the ship could continue sailing into the future.